Right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast. BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Well, earlier tonight I recorded my upload for the day, Louis Myers Q&A, and we talked about the Zodiac suspect, Louis Myers, but I just had some unfinished things that I couldn't stay silent about. This is one of those cases where it's like once I started, thinking about it a little bit more in order to prepare for the Q&A that we did, I just, had so many ideas racing about the case. And one of the things that we do on this channel is sometimes we do devil's advocate, where I kind of argue a case in a particular direction so we can kind of examine something and see how it holds up under scrutiny. And I would like to do that now. Right now, let's argue that Louis Myers was not the Zodiac killer. And it might be difficult to try and prove a negative, but let's look at the interpretation of the evidence in a positive way. And let's say that the interpretation of the evidence suggests that somebody else was the Zodiac killer. I also need to restate that about 1 year ago, I really thought that Louis Myers was indeed the Zodiac killer. I mean, I thought he was my prime suspect. There's always a possibility it's someone else. It's an unsolved case. Unsolved, mystery. Yeah, okay. But I thought he was my prime suspect. I really thought that Louis Myers was someone who had answers to all the questions. He, of course, comes to our attention from an individual named Randy Kenny, who was a close friend, who claimed that Louis Myers gave him a deathbed confession. Well, let's play devil's advocate and let's look at what if Louis Myers is not the Zodiac killer? Alright, well, the biggest thing that I would say that draws attention to this suspect is everything fits like a glove. Everything fits perfectly. Louis Myers worked in a restaurant with Darlene. He knew the victims personally. He went to high school with some of them. And it's like, it almost fits too well. It almost is like somebody went back and they looked at the Zodiac story and they composed some sort of fictitious way to answer all the questions. Maybe it was Louis Myers and maybe it was Randy Kenny. Believe it or not, I actually believe that it was Louis Myers on his deathbed. He sort of thought that, how can I do something just to give closure to the families? Perhaps even thinking, well, how can I help out Randy Kenny? Well, he's my good friend. Let's just, even help him out. He'll probably get some fame and notoriety for this story. And the reason why I believe that this could be fabricated is Louis Myers does not match a single physical description of anyone on the Zodiac suspect. Any of the top prime suspects, they all look differently than Louis Myers. All of the witnesses who have given any sort of description tell of someone who is absolutely different than Louis Myers. We're talking about the hairstyle, we're talking about the physical features. Even the people who are commenting about the Zodiac's physical characteristics in the comment section, everybody's giving a description of somebody larger than Louis Myers. He matches no physical descriptions. Furthermore, we had someone identify a photo of Lawrence Kane saying this is the person who attacked me. Things like that don't exist for Louis Myers. People don't even have him on the radar. And, I mean, I think before we look at the things that most people go for when they're trying to debunk this case is they want to focus on his age, about him being 17 years old. Well, I don't necessarily think that that's a good thing to do. What I think is much better to do is sort of conduct the forensic autopsy, like a forensic autopsy where we sort of act like, what was the person thinking before they died? And I've kind of given some big hints to this one, but I believe Louis Myers had something. He's thinking something where he's just like, I knew the victims. I mean, like, he was a classmate of some of them. He knew Darlene Ferrin personally. All parties are in 100% agreement with that, and even though he has the highest amount of physical contact with Darlene, or we should say social contact, I mean, Richard Gaikowski comes very close, working in the newspaper office at the same time as Darlene's husband, but Louis Myers and Darlene Ferrin were co-workers. And it really is kind of a nice narrative about how Louis Myers actually created the Zodiac as sort of a lover's lane jealousy killing spree. he was, very upset about not being romantically involved with those two girls. So he turned to becoming the Zodiac. It was a way to get revenge as a jealous, rejected lover. And of course, he would have killed Paul Stein for drug money. Now, here's a big thing. A lot of people are like, what about Sherry Joe Bates? Is it possible that either Louis Myers or Randy Kenny researched the case and they composed this fictitious narrative and then they just decided to eliminate Sherry Joe Bates because they just didn't research that part? I don't know. I mean, I just really thought that everything was just. It's almost like, that saying, "It's quiet, too quiet." It means like there's something wrong. Well, it's also possible that the two guys concocted this scheme together, but I'm not even sure if that happened. It's almost just like someone who could not have possibly been the Zodiac sort of thought of a way to at least leave the world by doing something somewhat nice. Furthermore, I mean, he could have come forward at any time. And not to mention, Randy Kenny doesn't have any good explanations about the ciphers. I probably did him a favor when I was like, Louis Myers was very interested in symbols, so that leads to the ciphers. That connection is totally fabricated by me. I mean, by fabrication, I mean that's my interpretation of the evidence, but you could just as easily interpret that evidence as Randy Kenny has no good explanations for the ciphers. So when we look at this, from a practical standpoint, we really need to recognize that there's a very why would all the physical descriptions of the Zodiac killer be completely different than Louis Myers? Is it possible that it's just not him? I mean, is it possible that they just sort of cooked up this story because maybe Randy Kenny is going to sell this story to somebody in the future? Or maybe Louis Myers wanted Randy Kenny to even do that. Maybe he genuinely wanted him to write a book and give the proceeds to the families. Maybe he just wanted to leave the world doing something while doing something good. Furthermore, what do we make of the confession in the 1970s? I wanted to say it was in 1976, but I mean, I might have gotten my dates wrong on that one. But we know in the 1970s, Louis Myers confessed to being the Zodiac killer to a long-haul trucker. On a personal note, I've since thought about that could be entirely fabricated, or in like to argue in the devil's advocate, I would say that is fabricated. They planned that whole thing completely. They were just like, hey, I'm going to write a book. I need you to say that Louis Myers told you that he was the Zodiac killer back in 1970, whatever. I mean, it's not that hard to do. All you have to do is just make a phone call. And then it's like, hey, if you fabricate this part of the story for us, we'll give you a part of the money. It's as simple as that. I mean, I would have to say that I don't know 100%. I mean, we have to stress this is all theoretical because it's an unsolved case. We don't know. But what I would say is it really looks like some guys were studying the case and they composed this narrative. And, like Louis Myers would have been someone who probably was somewhat aware of the Zodiac stuff going on because he did live through it. I mean, he was definitely in the Bay Area and he was out of the country from 1971 to 1973, but being in the army from 71 to 73 does not make you a murderer. I mean, spending time in Germany from 71 to 73 does not make you a murderer. And in some of my very first Zodiac uploads, I was just like, I don't care what somebody did not do. I care what they did. So it's like, all that can really say is just that for a time, he left the Bay Area. That's all that was. Let's really examine some of the things that are kind of pressing with the Louis Myers case. How likely is it that someone put this amount of detail into it, like as a teenager? We're talking about referencing operetta, we're talking about referencing of, I believe there are even references to bizarre comic books and such. I mean, I'm not necessarily sure if this was the work of 17-year-old Louis Myers. Perhaps it could be the work of somebody older. And what do you guys even think about all the Zodiac letters being genuine? I mean, that's kind of a pivot from the devil's advocate, but I'm really beginning to think that a lot of the stuff could be kind of people just submitting things in the name of the Zodiac that weren't really sent by the actual Zodiac killer. In other words, I believe that people were kind of just trolling the police by sending in some things. I mean, trolls had to do something before the internet. Do I think that Louis Myers is a troll? No, absolutely not. I think he's someone who studied the case and was just like probably telling Randy Kenny all of this stuff when he's just like, hey, write a book and, give the money to the victims' families. He's trying to do something good while he's leaving the world. He's fully aware that he looks nothing like the Zodiac killer and he doesn't match any of the descriptions. So he's like, alright, let's get this whole narrative perfectly composed so all the answers work out. So we have a good explanation for everything except Sherry Joe Bates and except any of the other potential killings. Remember, there could be as many as 37 killings for the Zodiac killer. About a year ago, well, sorry, no, this is more than a year. I did my uploads a year ago. I found out about Louis Myers well before that, and I was watching something on YouTube, and I was just hit with this overwhelming feeling. It's like, holy crap. Everything they're saying just lines up perfectly. They've provided explanations for everything. I mean, it's like, but even if it's killing the taxi driver for drug money, he has motivations to murder all of the previous victims, Lake Herman Road and Lake Berryessa. All of those things have explanations provided that are just so simple. But at the same time, there is just such a low chance that this was indeed Louis Myers. I mean, it's like the physical descriptions are one thing. Some of the obscure references in the letters may not necessarily have come from him. Furthermore, well, not people are really describing someone who just doesn't seem to fit the Louis Myers MO, and it's just we don't necessarily know yet. A lot of the things that I think reflect more of just somebody who is like, hey, I got arrested a few times in my life. I did a lot of bad things in my life. What can I do to kind of leave the world and at least do something good in my very last moments? Even if Randy Kenny doesn't earn a cent from this, even if he did write that book and he didn't make a single dime, he would be like, I helped my friend Randy Kenny go on to bigger things. I helped the victims' families get some money for the horrible tragedies that happened to them. Furthermore, I gave them closure so they don't have to think that this is any sort of unsolved mystery. Is it possible that some guy was just on his deathbed and was just like, alright, I'm going to try and do something. I'm going to try and do something good for the world. Either that or Louis Myers was indeed the Zodiac killer, and maybe he just kind of put some hair dye in his hair, and then he was dressed really, really in very puffy clothes or something. That's why all these descriptions come out as someone who's much bigger. I mean, we really do have to insist, like, why do people keep reporting that all of these witness sightings are talking about someone that looks nothing like Myers? Probably because it's not him. Moreover, it's like, something has always bothered me about that confession in the 1970s and how easy it was to track down a person who was told that Louis Myers confessed to him. It's more likely that that was orchestrated, that they just, called up somebody that Myers knew in the 70s and they're like, hey, we want you in on the story. I'm going to write a book about it. You'll get a cut of the money. All you have to do is go along with the story. That's kind of an easier thing to believe. But I don't know what you guys think. I would honestly hope that this would have been true. I think it would be very nice if this had been true. I think it would be a good thing, to actually solve the mystery. I mean, some people are really enjoying the unsolved mystery aspect of things, but I think a lot of us also just want answers. I mean, I would love to just say Zodiac Killer, case closed. And for a brief time, I really thought that that was happening. Some things, though, well, I guess I should say, that kind of concludes my devil's advocate arguing in favor of Louis Myers not being the Zodiac Killer. But I would say some things, though, is that no matter what anyone does about the Louis Myers case, we should recognize that he was in the Bay Area at that time. He does have personal connections to multiple victims. He does have explanations provided for everything. And this is something that, people should kind of approach with some caution. I just really wanted to play the opposite side because this was some guy for a while. I thought he was my prime suspect, not because of, well, it's because of the narrative. And now I'm kind of forced to admit that maybe that narrative is so perfect because it was fabricated. Maybe that's just something shiny to get your attention. And maybe these guys, I don't even know if it was Randy Kenny or Louis Myers, they just concocted this scheme to write a book and sell it, even if they're just going to actually give the money to the victims' families. Maybe they just had a plan out of goodness, or maybe they just wanted fame and notoriety. I don't know about that, but what I can say is that is one well put together narrative. What do you guys think about that? It's been a big day talking a lot about Louis Myers, but thank you so much to anyone who's made it to the end of this podcast recording. I will always say, though, that Louis Myers is someone who stood out to me as kind of different than the other suspects. A lot of the suspects have a very large kind of giant question mark. Like, we have to assume the motive. We have to assume what they were thinking. Whether it's like, Ross Sullivan or Richard Gaikowski. And, recently now we've been talking about Lawrence Kane. It's like, we have to assume that their motives for certain actions. But with somebody like Louis Myers, it's all just spilled out right there for you. We can tell you why he committed every single one of the murders. I mean, once again, thank you for listening to this little upload. I mean, it started out as mostly Devil's Advocate, and then I said, some counterbalance at the end. Thank you so much to listening. If you have anything to say at all, comment below. Challenge me on this one. I want to hear the absolute biggest challenges you have. If you want to be like, hey, dude from Black Box Radio, you're totally wrong because of this, and this, post it. Don't hold back, because let's expand the discussion so we can get answers.